Now, as you take your seat, just keep your place right there in Daniel chapter 2. It's a long chapter, and I asked Pastor Chris to share the joy of reading this passage with you, because this is the passage that really is the key. This chapter is key to the rest of the book, because here the Lord sort of reveals what's going to happen after the time of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. March 22nd, 1975, I remember it well, frankly. I was only 15 years old, but I remember it. It was the night that Kentucky was playing Indiana in the finals of the Mideast Regional in Dayton. Now, Indiana was undefeated, and they had demolished Kentucky earlier in the season, and that was the game in which the friendship between Joe B. Hall and Bobby Knight ended once and for all. Because with Indiana up by something like 20 points at the end of the game, Bobby Knight was being Bobby Knight. And Joe Hall walked down the court and hollered something at Bobby Knight that I will not repeat, and Bobby Knight took umbrage at being spoken to during a game, and even though these guys had been fishing buddies and hunting buddies, Bobby Knight famously sort of clipped Joe Hall in the back of the head, touched him, and man, it ended the friendship. So that night, March 22nd, 1975, it was an important night. Indiana had an undefeated season riding on the line. They were by far the favorites to not only win the game, but to win the national championship, led by the dominant presence of Kent Benson. Joe Hall had a young Mike Phillips and Rick Roby, and he had Jack Givens, and it was their first season playing, I think. And the thing is that before the game began, in the locker room, the team comes in for the pregame strategy session. But written on the chalkboard were 4 words, each with an exclamation mark after it. It said, Nets, bus, police, Coliseum. And all the team sat there wondering, what was this about? They're trying to figure out what he was trying to say. They looked at him like, aren't you going to talk strategy one more time? And he wasn't. Kyle Tucker writes the account of this in The Athletic. He says, Hall rubbed his thumb through nets and finally broke the silence. Use the scissors when you cut down the nets today, he remembers saying. I don't want anybody on the ladder with a knife in their hand. And I want everybody going home with us on the team bus, nobody with parents. I want all of us together for the ride home, because when we cross the state line, the Kentucky State Police are going to be there to escort us all the way home. And we'll go to the Coliseum, which will be monitored by a blind fire marshal who won't see a thing when they pack the place for the largest and longest celebration of a win in the history of Kentucky basketball. And it happened, just like Joe Hall said. He didn't talk strategy, he talked victory. He talked about what's going to take place afterward. Those 4 words defined what was going to take place after the game, which Kentucky indeed won and ended Indiana's their undefeated season. Kentucky went on to lose the national championship to UCLA. It was John Wooden's final game, but every Kentucky fan knows that that's one of the greatest victories in the history of Kentucky basketball. I think of that when I read Daniel chapter 2, because God is speaking through Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel to tell us the way it's all going to end. It's like he's writing 4 things on the chalkboard saying, here's what it's coming down to. Now, a lot of times when you read Daniel 2, it's the story that gets attention. I mean, in Vacation Bible School, we tell this story, the king having a dream, and the king doesn't even remember his dream, and he calls on all of his wise men to tell him not only the interpretation of the dream, which any Chaldean wise man worth of salt could make up one, right? The king wants them to tell him what he dreamed as well as what it means. Well, they all said, well, that's impossible for anybody to do. And he said, you're buying time. I know what you're up to. And this king, moved by his temper tantrum, he decrees that all the wise men in Babylon are to be put to death. They're of no use to me. They're of no account. And so he speaks with the authority that only a king has, that he can declare their death. And so the captain of the guard is going through the kingdom, and he's going to gather up all the wise men and put them to death. Daniel says, what's the haste? Notice, before Daniel ever has the interpretation of the dream, he gets an appointment with the king to tell him the interpretation. Did you see that detail? And then he gets with his colleagues, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, and they pray for God to reveal the dream. And that one simple line, that then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Man, what an incredible testimony. And Daniel, when he gets this, what is his first move? Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel prays that the Lord would give him the interpretation, the dream and the interpretation. God gives it. And Daniel's first move is just to bless God. Listen to that prayer Pastor Chris read. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness. The light dwells with him. When Daniel gets this, then he calls out to the captain of the guard and tells him that don't kill any wise men yet. I'm going to interpret this to the king. He says in verse 27, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Now circle that, because frankly, this is what the book of Daniel is about. And this chapter is the key to the rest of the book of Daniel. This is about what's going to happen in the latter days. And so he tells Nebuchadnezzar that that's what this dream is about. He says in verse 30, as for me, well, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, and its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. And as you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and all the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw, the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and shall bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. Now, the story is what points to the meaning. It's the story that gets us to the point, not just of this chapter, but really of Daniel. God is revealing his plan for, when we talk about history, we're usually looking backward. And it sounds sort of an oxymoron to talk about future history, but I've got no other term for it. This is God revealing future history to Daniel and to Nebuchadnezzar. Here's the way world history is going to progress. And God reveals his plan. There's several things here that we need to notice what God is doing. God reveals his plan, first of all, through means. In Hebrews chapter 1, this is how the book of Hebrews begins, is by saying that in the past, at different times and in many different ways, God spoke through the prophets. He spoke in dreams and visions. He spoke in a lot of different ways. But in these last days, the writer to the Hebrews says, he has spoken in a son. And that is exactly right, that in the Old Testament, you have God speaking in a lot of different ways. He speaks through the prophets. He speaks through Moses. He speaks through the biblical authors. And he speaks through men like Daniel. God's revelation is a very serious thing, but he always uses means to do it. In this case, the means is a dream. And the dream is a secret itself. It's not that Daniel could make up the meaning of the dream. God has to reveal to him the dream as well as its meaning. But God reveals his plan through people, through human agency. In this case, it's remarkable that God is revealing future history through a pagan king. Nebuchadnezzar is not a believer. He's not a Jew. He doesn't revere the law. He doesn't care about the sacrifices. He destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And yet it's to this pagan, wicked king that God reveals his future plan. He uses not just means, he uses people. But however God speaks, whenever God speaks, it's always by grace. It should not be lost on us that God is never obligated to communicate to humanity. He doesn't owe us anything. He doesn't owe us allowing us to know that he's there. He doesn't owe us grace. He doesn't owe us salvation. It's always an act of grace that God reveals himself and his will to us. He could have remained a mystery. He could have been silent, and we would only have the heavens to know that the order in the universe bears witness that there's someone there in control of all this. But instead, God has revealed himself through special revelation at different times in different ways, but most significantly through his Son, Jesus Christ. But it's always by grace. It's God's love for humanity that motivates his revelation. Now, God's plan that he reveals here to Nebuchadnezzar has ultimate meaning. And this is not him merely revealing what he's about to do. There are a lot of places in Scripture where God reveals what he is about to do. Like through Jeremiah, he reveals that he's going to take Judah into captivity for 70 years. That's a sort of the near focus. Here's what I'm about to do. He tells David in 2 Samuel 7 how he's going to use his son to build the temple. That's what he's about to do. But here is a place where God is revealing the long focus, the long game plan. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how it's all going to unfold. Here's how it's going to resolve itself. Here's how I'm going to consummate my purpose and my plan for all of humanity and for the world. And this ultimate meaning is, first of all, for the world historically. I mean, God is speaking about specific kingdoms and eras that are going to unfold. Don't ever let it be lost on you that God's purpose and God's plan encompasses all of the world and all of world history. Every nation, every people, every ruler. God is completely involved with his creation. He didn't just get the ball rolling and then sit back and watch it continue of its own momentum, and what happens, happens. God is intricately, intimately involved in the very workings of his universe. He knows every detail. His omniscience encompasses every hidden fact. His personality is acquainted with every human being that ever has lived or will live. His will, his plan encompasses every detail of world history. Has ultimate meaning for individuals personally. Did you notice that when God reveals his plan to Daniel, Daniel begins by praising God. And in verses 21 through 22, it's just his praises of God. He begins his prayer, as always, we're going to see in this book, he always begins with a prayer of adoration and worship of who God is. And then he moves from this worship and adoration of God into specific thanksgiving for what God has done for him. You don't see a personal pronoun of Daniel in his prayer until verse 23. To you, O God, my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might. Here Daniel is finally in his prayer. He's praising and thanking God not only for who he is cosmically, universally, but for God's personal, intimate work in his life. God acts personally. He speaks to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream. He speaks to Daniel. We're going to see that he's intimately involved with Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah. He's involved with his people. And Daniel here reflects not only this cosmic, universal action of God, but also the very personal, individual way that God knows him, the way God answers his prayer. But also this plan has ultimate meaning for believers ultimately. Because what God is revealing here is that he's going to act in history so that kingdoms and kings rise and fall. And they don't get better. By the way, they get worse, right? The pattern you see in this dream and its interpretation is governments and kings are declining, that each successive kingdom is inferior. Begins with a head of gold. It gets down to the feet and toes that are mixed with iron and clay. And it's as though God is saying, now, don't put your hope in any of these human governments and any of these earthly kings. They're just going to fail. They're all going to rise and fall. None of them are here for forever. But there is coming an action of God that will destroy all human kingdoms and will establish God's kingdom. Now, we live in a moment much like Daniel lived in which we look around ourselves and we feel like we're not at home. I mean, Daniel is in exile. He was taken from Judah. This isn't his native land. He's not speaking his native language. And he's not able to worship in the temple. The temple has been destroyed. I mean, it seems dark. But when God is on the throne, is any time really dark? I'm right now reading Andrew Roberts' biography of Churchill. Andrew Roberts has written some tremendous biographies, and he's just a tremendous historian and biographer, and I'm really enjoying this. And I was struck the other day, I'm just now up to the part of the book where the United States has entered World War II. You know, Winston Churchill was not made prime minister till he was 65 years old. And his whole career had been a series of ups and downs, and there was a period of more than 10 years in which he was like in the desert in British politics. He was a pariah. No one was listening to him. And he saw the menace of Hitler and the Nazi regime, as he pronounced it, the Nazis rising on the European horizon. And he warned, and no one was listening. And Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister, is appeasing Hitler and making peace with Hitler. And Churchill alone is warning Great Britain of what is to come. And everything he says will happen, happens. So to him falls the premiership. He becomes the prime minister of England. And God uses Churchill, I think, in one of the most formidable ways in all of human history. This man alone, in certain ways, saves Western civilization from Hitler and the Nazi regime. It's a remarkable story, but there's a place in there where in 1940, Winston Churchill goes back to the school where, as a boy, he attended, of the boarding school, Harrow. And they have sort of a homecoming thing. They call it, I think, Days of Song. And they had their school hymn was called Stet Fortuna Domus. How many of you had a school hymn in Latin? Stet Fortuna Domus, which is basically let the house be established. And they added a verse. Churchill goes back. He's sort of the hope of the nation to survive this war that has been inflicted upon them by Hitler and the Nazis. And everybody's rallying around Churchill. He has like 88% approval ratings. And when he goes back to Harrow, they've written an extra verse to their school hymn. And the verse goes, "Nor less we praise in darker days the leader of our nation, and Churchill's name shall win acclaim from each new generation." I mean, what a nice verse. For one of their alumni, they add this verse, and great hope that Churchill, one of their graduates, is going to lead the nation through these dark days. Well, Churchill gave a speech there, and he announced that he would like to alter a word in the verse dedicated to him. He said, "I have obtained the headmaster's permission to alter darker to sterner. Do not let us speak of darker days. Let us speak rather of sterner days. These are not dark days. These are great days, the greatest days our country has ever lived. And we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our stations, to play a part in making these days memorable in the history of our nation. Now that's one reason why he was able to lead them through those sterner days, because he saw in it an opportunity. Everybody was talking about how dark it was. I mean, the Battle of Britain was raging, and the Luftwaffe were dropping bombs on London and all over the country. And Churchill refuses to say these are dark days. They're stern days. But what a day of opportunity for each of us to fulfill this great destiny. Precisely right. That is the way that Christians should see the moment in which we live. This is only dark if you don't have the light. If you don't know Christ, indeed, these are dark days. But if you know how this story ends, if you know about that rock that is cut out of the mountain without human hands, that it is coming and it's going to destroy the human governments of this world, then you can have great hope. And in this vision that Daniel interprets, this becomes the recurrent theme. The rest of the book, we're going to see the discussion of these four kingdoms and of the ultimate kingdom of the Son of Man discussed for much of the rest of the book. The four divisions of the future from Daniel's time were about these four kingdoms and then the ultimate kingdom. Now, I want to say something. That these four kingdoms, I'm going to tell you who I believe they are, and there is some debate, but you know I would not tell you anything false. What I say is absolutely true, so you can believe it. But they really are mostly identified in the rest of the book, but I'll just admit that there's some debate about the identification of these. But what I think is beyond debate is that God is not telling Nebuchadnezzar only about the identification of these kingdoms, but about the kind of kingdoms that they represent. For instance, we're told the identity of the first kingdom, right? No question about that, because Daniel says, you, O king, are this first one. The first kingdom is the kingdom of Babylon, and it is a single monarchy. Now, I believe the Bible presents that the purest form of government is a pure monarchy in which there is a righteous king. Now, the problem with that is in the realm of human existence, there are very, very, very few righteous kings. And a lot of kings start out well, don't end up well. In fact, I would argue that you don't see any truly righteous kings except the one who is to come. But if you could have a king who is truly righteous and who cares about his people intimately, who personally manages every detail of his kingdom, this would be a wonderful government. A king who cares about his subjects, a king who makes sure that their needs are met. And this, of course, is the kingdom that we look forward to, the kingdom of Christ. This is the way he rules in his spiritual kingdom now. But this first kingdom is a pure monarchy. I don't argue that Nebuchadnezzar is a righteous man, but the form of his government is that it's a single monarchy. He's a single king. He's ruling as a king, and this is the head of gold. The second kingdom, I believe, is the kingdom of Persia. But if you study world history, you know it's not called merely Persia. It's the Medo-Persian Empire. It's the Medes and the Persians. This is a dual monarchy. So the Persian monarchy actually usually has two kings, but it's two peoples. And so there's an attempt to rule these two peoples. And Daniel clearly says in Nebuchadnezzar, now this kingdom is inferior to yours. There's going to come one after you that is inferior to yours. Now, may I just note that this tells us the world's not getting better, right? Governments aren't getting better and better and better. This is why there are some people who believe that the Bible teaches that the world's going to get better and better and better, and then we're going to get so good that we usher in the kingdom. This was really a lot of Baptists believed this during the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then the two world wars sort of wiped that theology out. We saw when the world's not getting better. Every new invention we have, it's used for evil. As soon as the airplane was invented, the next thing you know, it's used for dropping bombs. We figure out how to turn some technological innovation into a killing machine. This is what humanity does. We're not getting better, we're getting worse. And these successive kingdoms are sometimes inferior. The third kingdom, and we're going to see this later in the book, it's identified as the kingdom of Greece, and specifically of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is not a king who sits on a throne, per se. He's a conquering tyrant. Alexander never stays at home ruling and administrating justice among his people. Alexander just takes his armies and he's just going to the far reaches of the known world, just conquering everything he can. And remember, you've heard the story that I think it's Herodotus who says that Alexander weeps because he has no more worlds to conquer. He dies very young. At 33, he dies, and he never really rules, but he takes his armies, he spreads the Greek language, Greek gods, Greek philosophy. As he goes through the world, he makes Greek the lingua franca. That's why the New Testament is written in Greek. It's because of Alexander the Great, as he spreads that language throughout the Western world. But he's a conquering tyrant. He's not an administrator. He's not looking out for the good of his subjects. He's merely trying to conquer and enlarge his rule and his riches. But then he says there's another kingdom. He calls it a divided kingdom. And this is the kingdom of Rome. And he describes it as, it begins with these legs of iron, but as you go down into the feet, it's iron mixed with clay. It gets softer. Now, I want to point out that a lot of times, especially in the book of Daniel, but in biblical prophecy in general, when a kingdom or a movement is described in the future, it's like God takes a snapshot of it at its beginning, at its inception. And so, though there are other Babylonian kings that are going to come after Nebuchadnezzar, the description of the kingdom is of Babylon at its beginning. And then the next snapshot you see is of the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then the next picture you see is of the kingdom of Alexander the Great. And that's a pretty short kingdom, but when Alexander dies, it splits up 4 different ways, and 4 of his generals rule in his kingdom from that point on. Until then comes the Roman Empire. And you're given a nuanced picture. It's not merely at the beginning. It's at the beginning and then how it changes, how it morphs. Early in the Roman Empire, the first emperor you have is Julius Caesar. But then the guy that really rules is his nephew, Octavian, or Augustus Caesar, whom Luke chapter 2 speaks of. But then after Augustus, you have a succession of different Caesars that come and go, and eventually the Roman Empire sort of, it morphs, it changes. The capital moves to Constantinople, and you've got the Roman government is spread throughout Europe, and it doesn't really end. We talk about the fall of Rome, but the reality is Roman ideas, Roman type of government, Roman influence, it pervades right down to the present and through its extension, its rule. We're going to talk more about this as we go through Daniel. the point that Daniel is making here, these four kingdoms, they rise and fall, each one successive, but sometime during that fourth kingdom, there comes the final kingdom. And this is the stone that's not cut out with human hands. It's cut out of a mountain, but not with human hands. So it begins during the time of the divided kingdom. So during the time of Rome, whatever that means, this kingdom is going to come. It's a kingdom that will never be destroyed. He says this kingdom won't be destroyed, and he says it will not be left to another people. He says that in verse 44. It'll never be destroyed. It will never be subjugated. And this kingdom is established by a rock. Now, we know who that rock is, don't we? We know that that rock is Jesus, because Jesus is not a mere human. He's the eternal God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So the eternal God becomes human, but not as the result of the desire of a man. He's not the product of the normal human process of sexual congress and procreation. He is planted in the womb of the Virgin Mary. He's a stone cut out of the mountain, but not with human hands. And this rock comes, and he destroys all the previous kingdoms. Now, we can talk about what that means. There are two basic ways of thinking about this. And it can be that it's not either or, it's both and. On the one hand, this is speaking of Jesus coming, and Jesus is born. How does Luke 2 start out? There went out a decree from Caesar Augustus. He's the emperor of Rome, and it's during that kingdom, during this divided kingdom, that Jesus is born. And so the rock comes during that kingdom. You can see this as a prophecy of the coming of Christ, and that's certainly true. But it says that the rock destroys those kingdoms. Now, how does he do that? Is this speaking about the spiritual truth that when you put your faith and trust in Christ, you become a part of his kingdom? You're no longer of this earth. You're a stranger and a pilgrim on this earth. You belong to another kingdom. You're a citizen of a greater kingdom. And that this rock of Christ destroys all other allegiances. There are some who take it that way, that it is speaking purely, symbolically, spiritually in that way. And that's certainly true that it is speaking that way. I don't doubt that it does mean that. The question is, does it mean only that? But it seems to me, and we'll see in the rest of the book, that God's saying more than the fact that this is a spiritual truth that's true in the hearts of God's people. I think it is saying that this rock is going to destroy the kingdoms. Now, we know from the New Testament that Jesus comes not once but twice. He comes once, born in a manger, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those that are under the law. But he's coming again with power and glory, and he's going to establish his kingdom on earth. But when you're standing in the Old Testament, looking forward to the New, remember, in the same way that God reveals each kingdom with sort of a snapshot of what happens in that kingdom, he speaks of his kingdom that way too. He doesn't explain through Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Jesus is coming twice. He doesn't explain that once he's coming offering peace and salvation, and once he's coming to overthrow the kingdoms of this world. He describes it as one thing. because he's looking in the same way. If you're standing, say, on the Great Plains and you see the Rockies in the distance, the Rocky Mountains, rising thousands of feet above the plain. You see all these peaks. You can see them. You can count them. You can see the different peaks. What you cannot really tell from your vantage point is their depth. Which one is closer to you? Which one is further? Which one is in between? You just see them as a mountain range, and there's no depth. There's just the peaks that stand out to you. And as you get closer and examine them, now you can see distance. Now you can see that these peaks that looked as though they were flat and almost equidistant from you, from the Great Plains, have great depth, and they're not that close to one another. They're perhaps 100 miles apart from one another. In the same way, when the Old Testament looks at the peaks of prophecy in the New Testament, it doesn't give us depth necessarily. It just tells us these things are going to happen. Jesus is going to come. He's going to offer salvation. He's going to heal the lame and give sight to the blind, and he's going to raise the dead, and he's going to abolish injustice, and he's going to right the wrongs, and he's going to sit on the throne of David. Now, when you read that in the Old Testament, it sounds like one thing. But you and I live between these peaks. We see it's not one particular time. It's he came once, and when he ascended to heaven, he said, hey, the angel said, hey, you men of Galilee, why are you gazing up in the heavens? This same Jesus that you see going is going to come back in the same way. He's going to come back bodily. He's going to come back visibly. And this is described by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It's described in the book of Revelation that Jesus is coming to rule and to reign. And we don't know when that is. It could be today. I always fantasize that one day I'll be preaching on the second coming and he'll come back right at that moment. And it'll be my greatest sermon illustration ever. That's what I pray for and I hope for every time I preach on the second coming. But the rock not cut out of the mountain by human hands is coming, and he's going to destroy all human government, all false rule and reign. Now look, this when Nebuchadnezzar hears this, he believes it, but it doesn't change him, right? He accepts it, but whom does he offer sacrifice? Whom does he offer offerings to? Daniel. He doesn't get it. Not yet. His time's coming. He's going to get it, but he doesn't get it now. And he says, oh, Daniel, you're great because you've revealed this to him. Now, he acknowledges Daniel's God. Oh, it's great that you have that God because that God has given you this ability to tell me my dream and interpret it. And your God is he says that your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect of the wise men of Babylon. He sees Daniel and says, oh, it's great that you can use your God to tell me this. But he doesn't worship God. He acknowledges the truth of this. He acknowledges this because this tells him his kingdom is secure for the moment. But listen, if you read this text, you and I stand on this side of it, and we know it happened just like Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar would. In fact, it happened so perfectly. The book of Daniel is one of the books most attacked by liberal scholars, and they try and give it a late date. They say, oh, it's pseudonymous. This really isn't from Daniel. This was written during the time of the Maccabees. This is written after all this happens, and it's just the writer using pseudepigraphy. In other words, putting a false name on it and acting as though he's in the past and describing what is going to transpire, even though he's writing it after it did. Well, there's a word for that, and that's called a lie. Right? If you're pretending to write predictive prophecy after the thing you're writing about, predicting already happened, how does that encourage anybody? This is God speaking to Daniel, looking forward. I think this was actually written during the time of the Persians. I think Daniel had written, there's part of it that is in the first person, part of it that's written by others, but this is the material that happens to Daniel, and this actually happened in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel is looking forward. And you and I can look back at world history and say it happened exactly like God said it would. Now, when God reveals the future, if the kingdoms of this world are temporary and they're going to be destroyed and supplanted, God said it was going to happen, and it did happen, and all that is left to be done from Nebuchadnezzar's dream is that human governments will be done away with once and for all, and the rock cut out of the mountain without hands comes and ultimately and finally establishes his kingdom visibly on this earth. That's the only part of this dream left to be accomplished. Everything else happened. Now, if that's true, you need to worship him right now. When Daniel got the dream, when he got the dream and the interpretation, what was his first response? Look at this, verse 21. Verse 20, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. When you see in the Old Testament that God told his people what he was going to do, that the Messiah was going to come, that he was going to send a Redeemer, that he was going to achieve and accomplish their salvation through the atonement, and that happened on Calvary's cross, that God raised him from the dead just like he said he would. When you see over and over and over the Bible predict the future and then it comes to pass, and yet there's still some things that are yet undone, if God has been true in everything up to this point, you better count on the fact that he's going to continue to keep his word until it is all done. You better worship him now. Because when the rock comes, it's clear that there are going to be certain elements of this world that are going to be destroyed, and certain elements that are going to be part of his kingdom. So if he has revealed this to us now, you need to worship him now, and you need to serve him in life. I told you last week that the hero of the book is not Daniel, it's Jesus. But I'm so grateful that the Lord gave us the example of Daniel, because here is a man, he and Azariah and Hananiah and Mishael, they're living in a time that they would never choose. Their nation has been defeated, they've been taken captive. The temple is destroyed. They've been separated from their families. They would have every reason to just give up and sit back and say, how has God forsaken us? And yet their response is exactly the opposite of that. They don't sing about dark days. They pray to the God of heaven to act in their lives in a way that is consistent with his character, and they serve him faithfully even in circumstances they would never choose and they do not want. But it's where a sovereign God has allowed them to be. And the most important thing in your life is that you serve the God who gave this dream and who made it all happen and will yet establish his kingdom. No role or relationship, no no achievement or attainment, no calling or vocation, no possession or position you could ever have is worth as much as serving him. It ought to be the most important thing in your life. Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest king on the earth in his day. And yet, even he realized that God was the Lord of Kings, he called him. You need to come to the realization that he's the Lord of your life. And if you have never put your faith and trust in him, this text doesn't just speak about what God did in the past. It speaks about how God has brought his Son, the King, to this world through the virgin birth, through the bloody cross, through the empty tomb, through the ascension to heaven where he rules and reigns, and from which he is coming back in power and glory. When you see that, you realize that God has done all of that to reveal himself to you, not just so that you might know, but that you might rule and reign with him. In his grace, he's extending an invitation to you to put your faith and trust in him so that you might be redeemed, that you might be forgiven of your sin, that you might be on the winning side of history. And that's not what the world says it is. It's about being on the side of the rock not made with hands. And if you know that God has spoken, that God has revealed the future, then you better plan for his kingdom. And you do that by repentance and faith in his Son who gave himself for you.